when engaging stories as sacred practice is beginning with the most basic piece of creating sacred space for that writing to happen. They say that, if you want to invite the muse, create a space for her to live in your space. So you might want to start as simply as creating an altar. That could be a very easeful way to begin. Lorraine's saying, I live in oh my gosh, I don't know how to pronounce that. Kelowna, BC, Canada, and I'm a member of a wild rider family. Beautiful, for 1.5 years, and love that. I'm 90 years old and always learning. Thank you, Lorraine, for being with us and inspiring us. Welcome, welcome. Talk about living in a different story, right? There's so many different ways to live in the story of aging. So, all right. So we are at the top of the hour, and just what I will say is that for the next hour, we're going to be together, and we're going to be in the gift of each other's presence, and that stories are created through listening. It's the greatest myth that it's just the storyteller who has the power. Storytellers have a lot of power, and we're going to talk about that. But really, more than that, the listeners are the ones that bring stories alive. So, yes, I did see that right. And welcome, Gail from El Cerrito Village. Wanting to expand my storytelling and tell stories behind the stories. Ah, great. Well, you are in luck because I'm going to tell a big story and the stories behind that story today. So let's begin by doing what I like to begin with, which is bringing ourselves fully here, fully in the present moment. And as I was saying, it's the listeners that bring stories alive. And so I'm going to invite you to close your eyes for a moment. And if you're anything like me and you go into a webinar, you might be like doing your dishes or cleaning. And I'm going to actually invite you to not do that just for this moment. I know the desire to do many things at once is there. But for this one moment, I'm going to invite you to give yourself the absolute gift of presence and of stillness. And to just find your breath. Just notice, how is your breath living inside your body? How's your breath living inside your body? Just notice, where is it? Is it in your chest? Is it in your belly? And can you invite it to go all the way down to the bottom of your back and expand? So I'm inviting you into an experience of expansion. Can you invite, maybe you can put a hand behind your back. This is actually a move from singing, where you breathe all the way into the back of your back. I'm going to invite you into this place of expansion today. And as you exhale, exhaling out anything that's in the way, any debris, anything that is between you and being a fully actualized storyteller in the way that means something to you. We all have different ideas of what it means to be fully actualized in our storytelling. So I'm going to ask you, what does it mean to you? What is your idea of fully actualized storytelling? And I'm going to invite you to continue to breathe in this way, just for a few moments. And as you breathe into that, I'm going to invite you to tune into your belly, your gut intuition, and your second brain in the body, and to just attune to, what does your gut say about why you are here today? What are you really here for? You didn't come to meet somebody that you don't know. You came for something else. You came for yourself. And don't get me wrong, I'm really delighted to meet you. I'm going to invite you to place your hand on your heart and to really tune into your heart. I'm going to talk later about following your heart. And what does your heart, what direction is it pointing you to? What is it pleading for? What is it asking of you? What does it mean for you? What direction would you go in if you were to truly follow your heart? And I'm going to invite you to attune to your intuition now. What is your vision asking of you? If you were to see yourself as a fully embodied storyteller, what does it look like in your mind's eye? And I'm going to continue to invite you to stay so attuned to your own self-knowing in terms of what does your gut intelligence tell you? What is your heart asking for? And what does your vision engage throughout the next hour? And I'm going to give you a quote. This quote says, "We think we tell stories, but stories often tell us." And I'm going to even say that before I say this, the stories often tell us. And how much do stories just interrupt your own ability to listen to your gut, your heart, and your intuition? They tell us to love or hate, to see or be seen, and often, too often, stories will saddle us and they'll ride us and they'll whip us onward and they'll tell us what to do, and we do it without questioning. Maybe you don't. I don't like that word we, but that's what the quote says, and I'm reading it. The task of learning to be free requires learning to hear those stories, to question them, to pause and hear silence, to name them, and then become a storyteller. That quote is by Rebecca Solnit. And I like to begin because it really talks about the journey of what it is to be what I would say a sacred storyteller, and what I'll also continue to talk about is a conscious creator in our times. At first, you have to know what a story is. Then you got to be able to name it. Then you got to claim your role in it. And then you got to decide what you're in service to. What stories are you wanting to bring forward? And then you tell the stories. And how often of us are we just talking story before we get going? I want to tell you something in terms of what the Hawaiians, well, I'll tell you what we're going to do today. I'm going to introduce you to the landscape of storytelling as a sacred art form, not as something that can be used against people or to manipulate people or to do anything. I'm just going to talk about what is it to be in relationship to story as a sacred art. We're going to talk a little bit about what is a story. I'm going to do something I've never, ever done before. I'm going to tell you a version of my story that I've never shared. I've been playing with different parts of it. So, Ray, you may have heard a little bit of it last time. And I'm going to deconstruct different kinds of stories while telling you my story. Okay, so it's going to be a show and tell as we go. And I'm also, what I'm doing here is I'm introducing you into a world of a community of sacred storytellers. So you don't know it, probably if you're new here, but some of you guys recognize each other. You know that there's a community that's beginning to come together and really form around what does it mean to be a conscious creator in our time? What does it mean to be part of that? And I'll talk to you about a story class that's coming up and ways that you can really engage as a sacred storyteller, both in classes and in community. And before I get into anything, I do want to just talk about some of the most ancient wisdom teachings in the world. That Hawaiians believe that words are so powerful that they can raise enough energy or slow the world into motion. That I didn't say that right. that words are so powerful that they can raise enough energy to slow the world or to set it into motion. So really think about that when we listen. I always think about music. Music is getting faster and faster and faster. You guys notice that? If you listen to music from like back in the day, it's so slow. If you listen to music now, it's so much faster. And as storytellers, we have the capacity to slow down time. Sicilians believe that words are so powerful they can poke holes in the universe. I always think about that when an argument begins to surface, that you can't ever take anything back once it's been said. You can do repair. You can't take it back. Australians say that the stories of the past must be sung to the present in order for the future to exist. And all the ancient religions agree that the world was sung, spoken, and chanted into existence. To me, that is one of the keys to the power and the unique role that humans have to play in our world and in the universe. There's a dangerous story, and we're going to talk about what is a story, but there's a dangerous story that people don't belong here, that we're not good for this planet. And I invite you to catch that story every single time and release it. It's one of my favorite games, catch and release. I name this, you see the story, you name the story, and you make a conscious choice whether or not you are going to allow that story to live inside of you. And so what is it to say no to that story and understand that we have this unique role in the universe where we can take a dream out of the invisible realms, give it the power of our heart, the vibration of our voice, and bring it into matter. We're on a dreaming planet. We can create a whole mythos. I wish I could spend an hour with you just on the mythos of that. But let's talk about some other things. And so I'm going to tell you a little story. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be talking about the art and craft of storytelling while sharing a few threads of my own story today. And thank you, everyone who's been talking about where you're coming in from, what you're looking for. So they say that we're all playing a game, and that some of us want power and some of us want influence. And this is a story about how I discovered what game I'm playing. So immediately, just with that one line, I placed you into the driver's seat of your own story. You're probably already asking, which one am I? Do I want power? Do I want influence? Or do I want something else? So just consider that. How do you give your audience a task? No one is listening to your story. I'm just going to tell you that right now. Everyone is listening to their own story through the vehicle of yours. So how is it when you walk onto the stage and take the place of sacred storyteller, someone who's giving, how are you creating a story that's universal, that gives people a way to see themselves inside their own story and to receive the gift while receiving the gift of yours? You might say that my arrival of my spirit forced my parents out of the cities and onto the land. They had been native New Yorkers. They'd grown up there their whole lives. They went on a walkabout around the world. And while they were in Africa, I came into being. And that inspired them to be part of the Back to the Land movement. And they went to Vermont. My dad was a veterinarian, and we had this veterinarian hospital that was connected to our home. And I got to be exposed to what it was to be in communion with nature and with animals at a very young age, and what it was to really respect animals and to respect nature at a very young age. And this was back in the 70s. I was allowed to roam wild. There wasn't this big fear of children being stolen. I got to hang out in creeks and wander in forests and find bones at spring. Lorraine probably knows a little bit about this, when kids could go out and not be, so terrified of being alone. And what I learned was that my first big lesson in life was about following your dreams. And it came from my mother. Because when I was the age of 3 years old, she realized that this life of living in rural Vermont and being married to my father was not the life that she wanted. And so she left. And she gave me a gift that has lasted longer than the pain of her leaving. And it was painful. And it was devastating. But she also gave me the gift of the freedom and the courage that comes with living the truth of what you are. So what I can tell you right now is that our stories don't ever change. That incident that happened won't ever change. But our stories change us and who we are. And how we tell those stories is what will make that suffering into an initiation. I spent much of my youth traveling through all of the states and traveling back and forth between Vermont, Virginia, and New York City. I was always the new kid in town. Has anyone else here always been the new kid in town or experienced that in their life? Yeah, Stephanie, it sucks. Just in case you guys weren't the new kids in town, it sucks. It is a really not cool experience for young children to have to go through. Children are not nice to newcomers at that age a lot of times. And for me, it was every single year. I got really good at studying people. I got really good at understanding how to get in and how to get out. And it was really painful, honestly. And books were my savior. They were absolutely my savior. They taught me how the world worked. They taught me about how to be with grief. They taught me what elders weren't talking to me about in terms of how the world worked. They taught me about what I could expect from life. And they brought me to worlds that I'd never even dreamed of going to. It took me way out of rural Vermont and into the world. And so I happen to be very, very lucky at a very young age, where my love of story and writing and reading, my mom noticed it and she put me into theater school. And there it turned out that I had a very natural talent. And my teachers noticed that natural talent. And I ended up applying to different programs and doing a lot of auditions. And a director at a local theater company noticed me and invited me to be the youngest member while I was still in high school of their theater company. And because of that, I got exposed to just an incredible array of master storytellers. And I consider myself lucky. So in here, I'm doing just a little bit of teaching story. Right now, you're probably wondering, was there an adult that was looking out for you when you were younger? Did someone notice your gifts? Or are you saying, did someone not? Were the adults not acting like elders? Were you not in a community or family system that knows how to call out the gifts in each other? So this is a nuanced piece of a story where you're looking at what happened for you as a child, but also if you're in an eldering position, you might be wondering, am I looking out for the young people in my own community? Am I taking it as a task to call out their gifts? So right now, what I'm also doing is I'm leaving a bit of a breadcrumb. It's a trail of becoming, and I think of that when we talk our stories, that we throw breadcrumbs. I'm going to talk to you about a journey. I'm going to tell you some key moments along the way, and I'm going to throw a breadcrumb to the people behind me so you might be able to pick one up along the way. And I feel like that with stories all the time. I'm listening to other people's stories and I'm like, what part of their trail can I follow so I don't have to relearn everything? I always think about this, it's like this is also the mechanism of eldering. We don't get a lot of this, and this is part of the evolutionary experience. Why should we all have to repeat each other's accidents when we can just learn from other people's? So I went into the world of theater. I was part of a professional theater company. I was touring around the state, and I really got that theater was my thing, and I wanted to apply for acting school for that and for college. And my parents sat me down, and they did something very crucial in my life, and they said, don't waste your time and our money on college if all you want to do is learn how to do acting. Go get yourself in a really great acting school, and we'll support you. And I did. I went to New York City and I got into Neighborhood Playhouse. I was in Sandy Meisner's, one of his last classes. And once again, I was one of the very youngest in the room. And they warned me, they said, just so you know, there's an 80% cut after the first year. And we've never had someone as young. There was one other guy that was as young as I was in the school. Otherwise, everyone else was going as graduate students. And they said, so we just want you to know the chances of you getting into the second year are very slim. And I didn't believe him. I was very, very talented. I'd been so successful up to this point. And at the same time, something very critical happened just moments before I went to that school. I was serving coffee at a local coffee shop, and there was a man that would come in. His name was David Ball, and he was a very famous civil rights lawyer. He worked for the ACLU. And he was very famous because he was a Black man that was representing the KKK on a freedom of speech case. And I really respected him. I respected his commitment to social justice outside the bounds of what looked like a normal way to express it. And I really valued our friendship. And when he asked me what I was going to be doing after I left high school, I told him I was going to be studying theater. And he looked at me and he said, it's not enough. And that haunted me my whole life, those words, that it wasn't enough. Sure enough, after my first year, it was an incredible year, and I was not invited back. And it was a horrifying experience. It was the first experience with real rejection I'd ever had. And I was embarrassed, and I was humiliated, and I didn't want to face any of my peers. And rather than become a victim of the story, I did something that would affect the rest of my life. Something deep inside of me decided to act in a way that I don't even know how it knew how to act. But I turned and faced the fear of rejection, and I decided to take the reins of the story. And I tattooed a symbol on my body that means changes for the better. And I didn't realize at the time what I was doing, I had just taken a step onto the path of my own true life purpose. I had decided that no one was going to define my path or my journey. I ended up staying in New York City another year. I worked off Broadway. I went to summer stock. I went to Williamstown. And I really decided that I was not actually built or designed for an industry based on rejection. And that's what it was feeling like for me. I didn't want it. And I also didn't want to spend a life speaking other people's words. And so I did go to college. And I studied that thing that brought me so much passion was environmental education. I got a degree in wilderness leadership. And I started to learn a lot about group process. And I began to really understand leadership. And there were these threads that were coming alive for me, this real passion about the environment. But there was also this thing that wouldn't leave me alone, which was story, because I had seen something both in the big stages and the small stages that when we got in that room, when we started to tell stories, when we created something in that space of theater, something came alive. And I wanted to understand how to work with it. I could see that we would create something and something magical would happen, and then the door would open and out it went. And I wanted to understand how to capture that. So even while I was studying environmental education and wilderness leadership, I would also do this performance track. We would create these amazing performances. And at the end of that year, in my college years, I fell madly in love for the first time. And my boyfriend at the time, we were looking out into the world of what we were going to do next. And I really wanted to go to Yale for playwriting. And he was like, you shouldn't do that. He was like, you're going to pigeonhole yourself in some very small career where you're never going to make any money and you're going to live a life of poverty. And he was, you might be thinking he's the bad guy right now. You might be thinking he's the bad guy. And at the time I just want to say, I thought he was the bad guy. I thought he was really steering me towards safety. And when I look back now, I think he was speaking my fears out loud. He was speaking my fears out loud, and they resonated in me because they were there. So what I did was just a little bit of a flip of a wisdom story right there. I could have made him into the bad guy. I could have made him in the villain in my story. And I told you right there, we did a little small stop, and I said, you don't have to do that in your own life. You can allow, where do you take responsibility for your actions? Even when people really do steer us in a direction that isn't in our best interest. So rather than go to Yale for playwriting, I went and I got a master's in social work because it was the safe thing to do. And David Baugh's voice was still in my head that theater, that the arts was not enough. And so I went to Richmond, Virginia. I got a master's in social work, and but still, the whole storytelling wouldn't leave me alone. It was driving me. And I produced a film called Justice Economized. I won a scholarship for it in graduate school, where I was talking about justice and economy and social justice and blah blah blah. There was just no running away from all of it. But there was this very strange thing that happened on the night before I started graduate school. I had this dream, and I had this dream that I was walking down the street, and I was about to enter the school, and I walk in the door, and they're all speaking a language that I can't understand in acronyms. I can't understand one word of what anyone's saying. And I walk outside, and there's this guy that's riding a horse, like a horse-drawn coach, and he's yelling at me, and he's yelling, "Follow your heart." And I knew that I wasn't doing it. The story couldn't have been more literal. I was entering into a world that spoke a language I didn't know, and I was leaving behind so much of my passion and so much of my connection to history and so much of my connection to my roots. But the dream stayed with me. So I ended up, finishing that degree. And I knew that there was something to it, and there was something that degree gave me. And it gave me incredible confidence of understanding social systems, community organizing. It gave me a real understanding of how systems work, and it actually gave me a bigger context for how to tell stories that could change the world. And it ended up being a very strange gift. And it ended up being a strange gift in another way, because in the very last week, the very last semester of school, I was offered to be introduced to do this interview. And I'm in this interview, and I decide to put my hand on my neck, and I'm really thinking of this moment. If I take this job, it's going to kill me. And as I put my hand on my neck, I feel this swelling, and there's a tumor that has grown overnight on my neck. And I immediately go to the doctor, and I'm diagnosed with thyroid cancer, with a very extreme case that's quickly growing. And they tell me that there's a very good chance I could lose my voice. There's nothing quite like being told you're going to lose something when you start recognizing how much you want it. And I realized I really wanted to use my voice for something. And so when that was complete, I understood that how life and precious short life is. And so I started my first nonprofit theater company, which was called the Performance Initiative. And it was committed to utilizing the arts for social change. And I never really looked back. I never used that master's degree. But in that piece, what we did was we created this amazing large scales, to this day, it was the largest scale event I've ever produced, outside, massive movie screen documentary, where we did all these interviews with people of all political views. The performance was called Engage. And I was looking at that young people weren't engaged in political life. I wanted to know why. And rather than be just another voice that told them to do something, I wanted to use the arts to actually ask people and to show people who they were in reference to this. So because of that strange job, I ended up working with Al Gore. I knew that working with live stage and working with film and working through documentary and developing this performance was kind of magical. And what we had done was we'd done something that no one had ever done before. We lined that theater event with 30 different organizations of different political views. That means that I had people that were standing for pro-choice next to people that were pro-life. And the belief was that if we had an engaged audience that could talk to each other and learn how to explore the issues of the day, that we'd have a better, stronger democracy. And what I learned in that also is that it takes so much energy to do live performance. I didn't know that I wanted to get stuck in that world. I knew that I wanted to work with story to have influence. I began to understand who I was. And so I went out to San Francisco with this dream of becoming part of a great influence of really bringing healing to the world. There's one other thing that I just want to speak to, which is that decision to go and study social work. There was a key piece where I really understood that we were going to be in a time of great change, and we were in environmental crisis. When it came down to how to work on environmental crisis, I understood that people can't save the world if they can't save themselves. They were in a moment in time. And I really believed that to create change in the global way, it had to begin inside of each body. And so I went out to San Francisco. I was like, okay, I'm ready. I'm ready to go tell stories on a big stage and have a great influence. I just didn't have a clue how to do it. And I ended up in my greatest fear. I was trying to figure out how to buy groceries and pay rent. I decided not to use my master's in social work. I decided to go fully into the arts and didn't have a clue where to begin. And I had the good fortune of having a very dear friend who had decided to let me go house sit for a friend for 10 days. And as I'm out there house sitting, I decided that I was going to make a plan. I was going to come up with this great big strategy for the rest of life. And I sat down to pray. And when I sat down to pray, I heard something. I heard a voice. And I wasn't used to hearing voices. I wasn't used to hearing guidance. I was just like, I'm gonna go for this, and I'm gonna listen. And this voice said, nothing. So I know it's not my ego talking. The voice says, nothing. Take long walks, swim in the ocean, walk in the forest, take baths. And to me, this was like a torture sentence. All I wanted to do was be successful. All I wanted to do was do something. And this was really absolute instruction to sit down and be for a little bit and just listen. Something I'd never done before. But I had these 10 days, and I was in this beautiful house that overlooked a cliff, watering the gardens. And I said, fine, I'll do it. And at the end of 9 days, I almost freaked out because I was like, I'm nowhere closer to figuring out my life. And I'm going to go back to the Bay Area and try to figure out how to make life work again. And all of a sudden, as I'm walking through the woods, I heard a whale singing. And I ran back to my computer thinking I was going to write some poetry. And what I wrote was the first 14 chapters of the book that was the answer to my prayers. In this story was everything that I most longed to address in this time, which was, how do we speak about the sixth mass extinction? How do we speak about the environmental crisis? How do we bring healing to these times? And how do we give people a sovereign role to play, where they're part of creating a greater dream for the planet than the one that we've inherited? And this story ended up being about a young girl who was called to by the whales to surface something that they'd been protecting, which is the dream of our future. I never could have thought that up had I been telling you that I was going to do something for the environment. That story came as a gift. And I've been following that story ever since. And that story has taken me to live off the grid. It's taken me into the wilderness for deep listening. And that story was a crucial part of me learning about what is story and what does it mean to be a sacred storyteller. But first, before all that happened, I did go back to the Bay Area. I stayed up for all through the night. I wrote the first 14 chapters of the book. It began to reveal itself to me. And then I went back to the Bay Area. And because of that very strange project that I'd worked on about political life, I got hired by Al Gore to work on a project that was very close to his heart, which was about getting people of different political perspectives to speak out on camera. And this was right before webinars, but right before webcams were created. So no one was doing this online at that point. And from there, I ended up producing and hosting the Green Channel at his television network. And to me, it was my dream job. It was everything that I'd wanted. And while I was creating this piece called Copenhagen, it was calling in from Copenhagen. We were following the climate talks. And I had scheduled, all these people who I thought would really bring meaning and understanding to our greater population about the climate crisis. And it was only me and Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! Who were covering the UN climate talks. And I brought in policy leaders, and I brought in political wonks, and I brought in all these people who could explain what was happening. But the only shows that people were watching from all that programming were the Dancing Penguins from 350.org. And they were watching a woman named Roz Savage. This beautiful interview that I did with her, who was this English woman who had been a banker and realized that she was not living her passion, that her passion was around ocean protection, and she left it all behind to row solo across the oceans to raise awareness around plastics. And something about seeing that data liberated me from a world that was constructed out of data, that I understood the danger of the news and information era. And I understood that it was the wrong way for me to be on. And that once again, I was abandoning my absolute true love and passion, which was storytelling. And so from there, they eventually shut down our entire division of current television. And when I had this moment, I was right there at a pivotal highlight in my career. I was known, I was recognized, I had job offers in other places. I could continue down that path. But I knew that it wasn't mine. And I think because of these other experiences, it was not so hard to get off of it. It was not so hard to face fear. And I understood for the very first time that fear is an ally. That when you actually turn and face the fear, it always gave me courage. It always made my life larger, not smaller. It was when I ran from fear that things always went awry. And so I turned and I faced the fear of the unknown again. And I followed this story. And all the while, I'm also studying and learning from, the world's greatest, the Bay Area. It's an amazing place to be there. Amazing visionary thinkers. And as I started to study more and more about, from all these different people and all these techniques around human development, I started to see that what I was feeling in theater was actually very close to what people were talking about in spirituality. That they actually were the same thing in so many different ways. And then when I started, they both ask of you two main things: presence and to be alive with a creative life force, and to allow the spirit to come into you. And I started to understand, and as I went into scholarship, I noticed that, oh my gosh, some of the very first acts of theater were rituals of allowing the spirit of Dionysus to live in human form. And so this piece that I had been trying to wrap my head around is what happens when we go into social change, and what happens when we bring a story to life, and what happens in the energy of those people, and how do we harness that energy for social good and for social change, and I would say for healing. And as I began to come closer and closer to that, I began to create this thing called story ceremonies. And once again, I was really lucky. I was in the Bay Area where there were just a lot of people that were curious about how we could show up in the best way for the times that we're living in. And so when I came alive with this form of ancient mystic storytelling, like I'm not even going to get into that whole story of how it came to be, but it was truly by luck, and it was truly by listening for that story. And when I shared this form of a mystic storytelling event with someone, with a community of friends, they all looked at me, and rather than say I was crazy for doing something so out of the box and so different, they said, "What was that? And can you do it again?" And if my friend and community had not looked at me while I was sharing something that I was so terrified to share because it was so different and so out of the box and not like anything anyone had ever done before, if they hadn't said, "What was that? And can you do it again?" I might not have discovered one of the most radically unique gifts I have to offer as a human, which is the doorway to this ancient mystic form of storytelling. But I had that community, and that community had me. And what I began to understand more and more as I went into the world of storytelling is that when you look at story as a mystery school, it teaches you everything you need to know. It gives you all the paths to the wisdom ways of what it is to be a great human. It teaches you listening. It teaches you connection. It teaches you authenticity. It teaches you bravery. But more than anything, it teaches you about connection. So I followed this path, and I ended up creating story ceremonies. We created really big ones. One of them was Story of the Witch, where we brought together 200 people to transform and heal this old story that was in our collective. We did the Story of Medea last year, where we did a massive forgiveness ceremony. We were looking at what spells are our culture under. And I began to understand that story and ritual have a place. It's the oldest place. It's actually how it started in our culture. And it's a way of bringing us together in the strangest of times. And it's a way of understanding how to be alive in the change that we're all a part of right now. And it brought me back to realizing, and I hadn't realized it, that when I tattooed that change was for the better on my body, I didn't realize that I was making a lifelong commitment to really being part of these changing times, of taking the reins of this great story. And that's one of the things I'm most passionate about, is teaching people how to take the reins on your story by teaching you how story works. So we're going to talk a little bit about, and I'll just say this one last thing, which is that if you find yourself at the bottom of the ocean and it seems like the world is just crushing down on you and there's no way up, then may there be some great rope that you can place one hand on top of another and climb out from the bottoms of the depths and come out to another place where you can breathe fresh air and perhaps even do something as miraculous as walk on water. So that little mechanism is ending with a story blessing. I learned that from Carolyn Casey. She learned that from John O'Donoghue, an Irish mystic storyteller. So that's a little bit of a story that I'm working with. And I wanted to do something which I've never done before, which really talk about the details of why I do what I do. And what I want to do now is talk a little bit about what is a story. And we'll talk about this together. What is a story? I'm actually asking you, what do you know about a story? What is it? And you can put your hand up and speak out loud, or you can place it in the chat box. Marilyn's saying it's sharing truth. Yeah. Truth is always it's a tricky word because it means such different things to different people, but it's actually a carpentry term. It's a straight line from here to there is what a truth is. But there's a universal truth. And I feel like when we share our stories, John Steinbeck says, no story will live unless it is about the listener. It won't be carried. So when we come up, it's like we're talking a story that's designed for the collective. Alice is saying it's a metaphor. And one of the things I love, I heard this from Carolyn Casey, metaphor is the language of spirit. Right? Isn't that great? It's the language of spirit. Melissa's saying that it's creativity and action. Yes. Nicole is saying it's a vision, it's a way, it's an invitation. I love that. A story is an invitation. I really do think it is. And it's an invitation to examine your own story. And it is true. Anytime you're listening to someone else's story, we're often trying to find ourselves inside that story. And really think about that. Whenever you look at a story and we're watching television programming, are you consciously or unconsciously connecting to one character? Oh, that's me. Stephanie's saying it's a reclamation, a remembering, right? It's a sharing, says Kati. One way that you can look at story is that story is an operating system. And I'm using this language because humans often refer to technology, the latest technology, as it refers to themselves. And so in that way, in that vein, if a story is an operating system, it teaches us what to believe in, teaches us our values, teaches us what's possible. And so start looking at these operating systems that you're surrounded by, because you're inheriting stories from your family system, through school, through work, through television. One little random thing to understand is like how our brains work and how we're able to engage stories consciously or unconsciously. As soon as we get on the screen, these are moving images. And so what's happening is that our eyes are actually, we're going into fight or flight. It's how the humans evolved. And as soon as we go into a fight or flight state, our critical thinking actually changes. Our mechanism for critical thinking changes. So think about the next time you watch television. How is your brain? We talk about, oh, I'm just going to turn off, I'm going to watch TV, right? What are you turning off when you're watching TV? That happens at all different points as you go. Versus listening versus reading. Your brain is engaging completely different ways. So Daniel's saying that story as a mechanism that conveys a message. Absolutely. And one of my most fun games that I like to play is going into the meta narrative. Can you tell what this story is telling us? What is really the story of climate change really about? I invite you to get your critical mind engaged. What is it really about? What is the story of vaccines about? This is a great example. What a hot topic, right? Some people have such different stories about the story of vaccines right now. And as sacred storytellers, one of the things I love doing is that we get to put on our story lenses. Okay, and I always think about this in terms of snorkeling. I go in the ocean and I go out without my goggles. It's kind of this terrifying experience. There's a big world that I can't see or be part of. And I've got my hands out and I'm like, I hope I don't bump into anything. And gosh, I hope that shark doesn't come get me. And how would I know what to do if it does? I can't see anything. When you put your story goggles on, it's no accident that the ocean is the metaphor, the symbol of consciousness. It's like you get to see through the consciousness. You can be like, oh, that's that story. Oh, that's that story. That's that story. And now I get to engage a choice, my sovereignty about which story I'm going to take on. And here's the big one, what role I'm going to play in that story. So Andres is coming with a question, say more about the truth. When someone asks, is that a true story? I like to say, of course, all stories are true stories, right? There's a lot of things, you can find more truth in fiction. That's why I love writing fiction. No one's going to argue about your facts, right? God, oh my God, who wants that? You can say so much through fiction. It's an opportunity to surprise and connect, says Anya about story. Yes. So now let's talk about, what is a sacred story? What distinguishes a story as being sacred? I'm seeing your fingers go to the keyboards. I feel like I'm watching a tennis match. What's going to happen next? Artemis is saying that it's timeless. Okay, so now we're talking about a story that lives with that it's bigger than the moment. I love that. Melissa's saying that everything is connected. Okay, so you're talking about this inner connection that lives in the realm of a sacred story. So that, and that's interesting. So you're saying, you shouldn't say it separates us, that there's a sense of interconnection. Alice is saying that something that teaches humility. Oh, yep, I'm in that path with you, Alice. We'll talk about why in just a bit. Basha is saying that it's an unveiling of a universal truth, right? I always call that the inner nod. You know, you can be talking about cancer, you can be talking about a fire, you can be talking about a loved one, and something in your experience rings so true, even though maybe I haven't had it myself, or maybe because I have had it myself. There's, even though if I haven't had the same experience, there's something in your, that what you're talking about is universal. You know, and so just think about, I told you a little bit about my story, and maybe you didn't you haven't walked that same path, but perhaps you've had some kinds of those same kinds of experiences, those same kinds of expressions, those same questions happen in your own life, and those are those universal truth moments. Racing that connects to you to something larger than yourself. Yeah, it reaches for the soul, says Marilyn. And Elisa is saying that people are left grappling with how story creates one meaning of the world. Oh gosh, you know, and it's kind of a thing, this whole gig of story making meaning of the world. In one ways, it's the oldest thing, right? We know that some of the oldest stories in the world are creation myths. What is a creation myth? But it's a land based. It's a story that comes from the land. It's about the land, and it gives us meaning about our place and how the world works. Nicole's saying that the meaning has been acknowledged, and Anya saying it sings to you out of joy. Wait, hold on. I'm making this up. She did not say that. Isn't that great? Sometimes we can just see what we want to see. I just got busted. Anya says it sings in you and out of you. It rings of the heart of things. Beautiful. It comes through you. There's a resonance. So one way to think about a sacred story is that it has life inside of it. What are we doing when we're employing the language of sacred? We're saying that there's a divinity. It's saying I see the life in all things. So when we're saying I see the life in a story, now I'm talking about that I see that there's spirit, that there's a soul, that there's an energy form inside the story. So when Alice says it's a humble, teaches us humility, you know, what is it to come as a humble partner, as an ally, to listen for a story? So oftentimes people say, I'm going to use this story. Oh, I always go, that's interesting. I love how honest language is. We often manipulate and kind of hijack language. You know, it's an example. Apocalypse. We're so afraid of the word apocalypse. Oh God, what does apocalypse mean? But it means a lifting of the veils. So yes, we are living in apocalyptic times, but that doesn't mean end of times. It means the end of the time of not paying attention to what's really happening. But apocalypse is a great thing. So again, the words don't lie. How people use them is something that should always be acknowledged. So you know, when we go back to this language of use, when people say I'm going to use a story, I was like, yeah, it doesn't feel good in my system. So I started researching the etymology of that term. And it takes you all the way back. If you really follow it and pick it apart, it takes you back to enslavement. Isn't that kind of fascinating? So what we're saying is we want to enslave something if we're going to use it. So that's not it's not respect and reverence and honoring the spirit and the life of something. That's like the ego taking control. I'm going to manipulate you. I'm going to use this ancient technology of story, and I'm going to manipulate with it. You know, and we live in that. We live in a time where stories are well understood. The technology of story is understood, and they are being used against us. To me, it's very, very meaningful at this time, in this time of great change, to understand the most ancient technology that brings people together when the world in so many ways is trying to pull us apart. Because when you understand story, you understand that there's enough space for all of us to exist with a lot of different perspectives. And that's, again, I feel like when you understand story, it gives you the keys of liberation. It gives you the get out of jail free card out of the paradigm. And so when we look at this, when we look at a sacred story, you know, coming back to this idea, it's a story that has life that's inside of it. But specifically, I would say that it has life that is serving life. It's a story that is serving life. When you hear a sacred story, you feel alive, you feel connected, and you feel exuberant. And maybe you touch something that you weren't willing to touch, a deep emotion. You got a new perspective. You learned something about yourself. You saw some part of yourself you didn't want to ever see, but now you did because this other person was so honest. All these things can happen when you see a sacred story. You feel connected, you feel alive. The other side of what isn't a sacred story, I would say, is a zombie story. This is a zombie story that does not have life inside of it. It's probably been a story that's been designed to be used against you. I would say a zombie story would plant seeds of fear, would plant seeds of hate, would plant seeds of separation. Stephen Jenkinson talks about the danger of casting spells. When we talk about the future, what did we start this class with? About this idea that, our words are so powerful, that the world is shaped by our language. So we talk about the future as if it's already happened. Now we're spell casting. So look, we've got this big story that the world's oceans are going to be empty by 2050. It's a big story. It's a big spell. If you live in that story, you might choose to just eat all your fish now because it's going to be gone, so might as well get it now. Talk about making that story come true. Right? But if you live in the story that healing, that we live on a regenerative planet that is designed to and wants to heal, and that with every step that we take, and every breath that we take, and every word and story that we give, we are creating that future. Well, now what role will you play? It's a different kind of story. So that is a bit of our story of our class today. And what I want to really invite you to do is to really just put on those sacred storytelling goggles. Enjoy yourself as you go around. And the best game that I love playing is, what is the story really about? What is the story really about? And give them the meta titles. Is this the story of greed? Is this the story of we can all do it together? Are we in a story of creating love on the planet? Are we in the story of possibility? And I invite you to take a moment and just consider, what story are you living in about your future? So for one moment, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and see yourself in the future. Let's go 10 years. Let's go 10 years from now. What do you see? What do you see? You're engaging your intuition. Not what you think is supposed to be there, but what do you honestly see? And now go 20 years in the future. What do you see there? And now 50 years. What was left behind? What kind of world were you part of leaving behind? I invite you to open your eyes and share with us what you saw. The good, the beauty, the not, the ugly. Share with us what you saw. I love that, Daniel. I agree. There's so much mystery that lives in story. Christina, that's a good question about spell casting. She's asking, is a sacred story a spell casting? I'm just going to speak to this one thing, which is, a lot of times, I was once introduced, I was doing a storytelling event at Burning Man, and someone said, well, Leah's going to lift your consciousness or raise your consciousness. And I was like, oh God. I was like, it's not my job to raise your consciousness. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to give you a place to explore your consciousness. What you do is yours. Anytime I hear a storyteller say, I'm going to make people do this or think this or feel this or see this, I'm like, well, enjoy your ego ride. because you're going to have this much people in the room with you. And what would you have really been a part of? So I really feel like when you come into sacred storytelling, you have your intention as a storyteller. And I always ask people, what are you in service to? One of the most powerful prayers that I've heard is like, it's not that I pray, that if someone has some injury, that I pray that they get better. That who am I to say what better is, or that healing their broken leg is better for them? I don't know what's better for them, but I pray for their healing, or I pray that the best path for their soul reveals. And it's a different kind of prayer. It's a different kind of relationship to their sovereignty. So same thing with storytelling. How can you go into a situation where your intention is so clear in terms of supporting people's sovereignty, not knowing or assuming that you know what is best for them? It makes a bigger story, and it creates a bigger space for all of you to exist within. And it creates a space where you can learn from each other. And what I would say is as a parting thought before we go through the vision part, is that stories are wholeheartedly created by their listeners. They're wholeheartedly created by the listeners. I know that sounds strange, because a person that comes on, they know what story they're going to tell. But the quality of listening and what's alive in the listener actually calls out into the story. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit to, what are you guys seeing? Jenny's saying she's owning her own design agency. That's awesome. I'm looking for someone for marketing if you're interested. Christina says that, is that okay? Ray is saying, I saw that I tell story that live after you. Okay, we're talking about leaving a legacy behind. Alice is saying that the indigenous people of northern Ghana enjoy economic stability and looked up to from the people in the south of Ghana. Right, so we're talking about a change in economy. Elisa is saying a city of gardens with aquaculture and fish ponds and children playing together. I love this vision, with the elderly and resting in nearby benches. The roads have disappeared mainly, and our friends come to visit us on trains. Gosh, that feels good. And I love that vision of the future. I can rest into that. How does that feel versus like so many of the images out there? Just notice that. How does that feel in your body to get to hear that? Marilyn's saying, I've been struggling with seeing that far ahead, but I'm hopeful it will come. Marilyn, what I love about this is how honest are you about what you're seeing? I once heard that there was a very small group of indigenous people, elders, that met in private in Kauai, and they were trying to see and share their visions of the future. And I'm not going to tell too much about this because it was designed to be in private, not to be shared, but they picked a year and they all went to that year and they couldn't see past it. They couldn't see. And that was the gift of them coming together, was that they were all having a collective piece that they couldn't see past. And what do we understand about the power of our language and visioning and story? Visions are given, right? We understand that. But they also live inside of us. They come through us. And what is it to be able to be planting a vision, planting a story in the future versus receiving a vision of the future? They're two different things. They're both very powerful. Anya's saying, in 10 years, I was telling a big fish story to my soon-to-be born child and their friends in the neighborhood park. In 20 years, I was ill and still sharing from an old wicker chair. And in 50 years, there was so much smoke and burning. I was long gone, but still watching. Okay. Melissa's saying dark sky and scars. And Toby's saying, I saw myself gathering stories from around the world and sharing them with the intent to raise awareness of many various issues. I love that, Toby. So that's our class for today. And I love this idea. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to play with what was it to have a relationship with your own intuition, and what is it to be in connection with what stories are you imagining, what stories are you thinking of, and what stories do you want to plant in the future? And it's one of the things in many storytelling schools and classes that they don't teach, this act of creating a vision story. It's sort of been, taken over by entrepreneurs. They're going to sell you on a vision of their business succeeding. And what would it be if more of us were spending more time and energy planting the seeds of the future that we most want to be part of, and developing those skills and techniques? And so that's what we're going in for. We start tomorrow this class called Vision Stories. I'm going to give you a link. I'm going to give you this link if you're really interested. I'm just going to say go to the link, just because a lot of my emails end up going into strange places like spam and things like that. So I'm just going to give you this. And in this class, it's a 4-week class. And what we are doing is we are spending time really developing our skills as a storyteller. So you're going to get to write a story, you're going to have a chance to workshop a story, and you're going to have a chance to perform a story. And this is really a place where you can develop confidence and play and enjoyment in a really supportive community. One of my favorite parts of these classes is that you also get your own private group to meet with outside of class. And so I really invite you, if you're someone that is really catching the whiff of sacred storytelling and you want to engage this more in your own life, then this is a way where you can come learn all the basic skills of storytelling in the spectrum of this, how to tell a vision stories class, a vision story. So that begins tomorrow. The other thing I will share is that I work with people one-on-one, and this is one of my favorite things to do. I don't call it story coaching, I call it story priestessing. And one of my favorite compliments that I ever got was, "You're not my therapist, you're my story's therapist." And everything I understand about what it is to be in your own evolutionary process is revealed in the way that you carry and tell your stories. So I've had everyone from people who work in policy in the government who want to make big change there work with me, to women who are healing their birth story, both in how they were birthed and birthing. I've had young women who are pitching Netflix stories. And so and people who just come and they just want to work with and heal their own story and understand how to tell their stories and how to bring their stories to communities. So if that is of interest to you, you know where to find me. And the other thing that I'm just curious about, because we're going to be doing something potentially different, which was I'm looking at actually creating an online community where people can come together and share stories. And if that's something that you would like to be part of, which on Mighty Networks, and be part of an ongoing community that comes together on a regular basis. And we'd probably have a little subscription fee of like $25 a month or something like that. Tell me, because we're really in this great question of how do we bring a place for people to continue to work together that doesn't live on Facebook, but also does support these growing, emerging world of the arts. And I think that if there's any story that I am on a mission to really shift and transform, is how much we've forgotten the necessary role of artists in our community and their value. And just to put it simply, one last thing I'll say is that beauty is what feeds the soul. Beauty is what feeds the soul. And artists bring us beauty. And they can bring us to the gateway to see the hardest things about the world with beauty that gives us the courage to face it. And that's beyond a world of fact and information. That's what lives in the power of storytelling. And so with that, I bid you adieu. And if you have questions, I'll stay on. And if you want to take yourselves off mute and say farewell, you can do that. And I'll stick around for a couple minutes and answer any questions that anyone has.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good to see you, Melissa.
Thank you.
Good to see you as well.
So much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Daniel. Good to see you again. You're a local. You're familiar.
Hey, Leah, can you hear me okay? I have a question.
Yeah.
I really am enthralled with what you say around truth coming from carpentry. And it's the first time I've heard it, it's from you. And so I'd love to hear just a little bit more about that.
I actually learned that from Stephen Jenkinson. And my best guess would be to look up, go to the etymology, the language of true, or I mean, I hate to say, do a Google search on truth and carpentry, but it's a term that was born out of there. And it's a straight line, and it's what I understand it. It's
Nice.
origins come from.
Nice. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you again. It's been fun
Yeah.
having you here.
Yeah. Yeah. Likewise.
Aaliyah,
Yes.
hi. We've not met before. I've been writing a memoir for, maybe years. I'm almost kind of as far as I'm going to go with it. It was the whole purpose was to heal my relationship with my mother, essentially, to understand what happened. And I'm kind of done with it. My attraction to you is your background in theater, and I'm a film director, documentary filmmaker. But now in the last maybe 10 years that I have to be productive and creative, I'm just wondering, I mean, what I'm searching for is, do I write a play about my mother's side of the family, which is fascinating? Do I, or do I just keep writing and try to elevate the level that I'm writing from? I like what you said about the meta story. What is the meta story?
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm just wondering if working with you would be helpful in sorting out my options, you might say.
Yeah.
I love theater. I wish I'd done theater as a director, as an actor, instead of documentary filmmaking, but social justice was my calling. So
Yeah.
I've done what I could do. Now what? And now what? I did
Yeah.
one play. I produced one play on Barack Obama's mother, which was sensationally fun to do.
Huh.
And now I'm like, oh, okay, now what?
What's next? Well, yeah, I mean, that is definitely something that I work with people on in terms of, how does the story want to come through? And I would just say for anyone who might be in a similar situation than Tori is, in terms of like, what form should my story come in? I really believe that there's two basic questions that you can ask. And I always invite you to take them to the woods. I feel like everything that I know, comes from going on walks. Sometimes I can't believe I'll feel guilty for in the middle of the day going for a quick walk. It's where all my inspiration comes. Like where the guilt could possibly come from is beyond me. So I would say, like, what are you in service to? Is a like a foundational question.
Yeah.
What are you in service to? Because I feel like that will often bring kind of that magnetic guidance. And then really trusting the story itself will tell you how it wants to be told. And what I would say right now, you could be in a tough situation because you've been writing for, did you say 8 years?
Oh, no, not that long, but I've written 200 pages and I've kind of got the highlights of my personal story and the family story.
Right.
Down.
So it's trusting that film, trusting that theater, and that trusting that some part of your instinct said to write a book. So I would trust that because these different mechanisms, how to think that way, but also trusting the question that's like, well, maybe this is supposed to be a play, and but also just trusting that part of you that says, wow, this is hard work. When you get to 200 pages and you're working on something, you actually start to catch the whiff of, had I known how much work it would take to write a novel in a series, I never would have done it. I'm so glad I didn't know. So
I would just go spend more time in the woods, on the beach, on the golf course.
There you go.
I'm doing plenty of that.
So if we were working together, I would start asking you if there's resistance in the way. Like we would start looking at, like, is there resistance? What kind of boundaries or stuck parts are in there? Because when you start, is this the story saying, hey, I actually want to take a different form, or is this some part of you saying, wow, this is I'm in a new structure that's really hard for me and I don't know that I want to continue? And both are worthy questions, but I think that would probably be where we would start, and then we would listen for what's the right structure for this story to come through at this time.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
Yes, Alice.
yeah. I wrote you in the chat. This fellow that I'm sponsoring in northern Ghana, he took a speaking course from the Global Eco Village Network that also centered on telling your story.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if that is enough for you, that he could maybe join in the future your online group.
Yeah.
It's in the future because I have to find a way to finance him. I'm yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Absolutely.
just an idea.
Good to see you again, Alice.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah, I love the way you speak. It's really wonderful to have your input and have your story and have your way of expression. It's oh, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Okay, good people.
Mhm.
Well, I wish you all the best. And if you want to hop in, then you know Vision Stories is coming right up. If you're interested in that mystic form of storytelling, I do private sessions with that as well. And you can learn more about that at medicinestories.com. And we actually meet once a month in a collective for a story ceremony called Hour of the Wolf on the almost on the new moon every month. You can learn about that on my website. And if you are interested in joining like a regular community that comes together outside the classes, tell me, because I'm definitely in the place of just taking stock of what would truly serve people at this time. And I'd love to hear from you. So otherwise, I wish you all well and take good care.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I'm sending an email.
Okay, that's good. Talk soon.